Anime release schedules, an art form, ever-changing, that nobody can seem to agree on. For decades, anime was treated very similarly to long-running television shows, like MASH or Family Guy or The Simpsons, where every single week a new episode of this IP would be released for the public to consume. And thus, this is the model that some of the most popular anime of all time follow, with shows like Dragon Ball, One Piece, Naruto, Bleach, and even Black Clover adopting the weekly anime release schedule. However, recently there has been a massive shift in the anime world, from a weekly release schedule being the standard to a seasonal release schedule being the standard, meaning that technically we're getting less anime from the IP we love than we used to. And yet, even though less anime is technically being released of our favorite IP, saying it that way is slightly misleading because we've had more anime created since 2012 than the rest of human history before 2012. But anime, by and large, are getting shorter, and people are loving that. But why is that? Why is less anime a good thing? Well, I guess in order to answer that question, we have to look back at the anime of olds that gave us more anime. See, because, well, yes, technically we got more Naruto, One Piece, Bleach, and Dragon Ball because they were released weekly, but the extra anime we got from all of these IPs because of their weekly release schedule is something that nobody wanted. But not all weekly release schedules create extra anime, as IP like Black Clover don't have filler or pacing issues, but because of the crunch of the weekly anime release schedule, many believe that the beauty of the Black Clover manga is squandered by the Black Clover anime, whose fights and still frames are, to put it kindly, for the first 100 episodes, lackluster. But all of the problems that come along with a weekly release anime schedule, like lackluster art, filler arcs, and pacing issues, may soon be a thing of the past, as it was revealed recently in an interview with Mishiyuki Honma, the president of Studio Period, the studio responsible for Bleach, Black Clover, and Boruto, the three big Bs, that Studio Period is considering switching the anime they have on hiatus from weekly release schedules to a seasonal release schedule, something that they've already done with Bleach and its 1,000-Year Blood War arc. And thus, two of the last three weekly release anime of all time, Boruto and Black Clover, may make the switch to the modern day release schedule. But what could this mean for Black Clover and Boruto? Does it mean that they'll return sooner than we originally anticipated? Is there enough manga out from either of these IP to adapt a new season of anime immediately? Will the shift from Studio Period send a message to Toho that they need to change their approach to One Piece's releases, possibly signaling the end of One Piece's weekly anime releases that have been going on for almost 25 years? Well, today we're gonna answer all those questions and a whole lot more, but first, guys, please, for me, like this video, subscribe to the page, and hit that noti bell. And if you want to hear more breakdowns on anime news and manga, go ahead and follow my anime podcast, Otaku's Anonymous, where me and Danny Mata break down everything that happened in anime and manga this week. It's available on YouTube, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts. And if you want to see me and my brand new tattoos live, come on down to Comic Palooza Memorial Day weekend, May 24th to the 26th, to see me do 6 whole panels about becoming an anime YouTuber and anime and manga. Do one more glamour shot of Emporio Ivankov, because it is the best tattoo that Brian has ever done for me. I mean, look at that. Like I already stated, weekly releases are fantastic at giving us extra anime. However, in Naruto's case, that extra anime was filler. And while some of that filler was good and gave us looks into pieces of information that we didn't get from the manga, most of it was awful, backbreaking, pace-halting garbage planted in some of the most hype moments of all of Naruto's manga, like the war arc, which made the anime feel as though every single episode they gave us about 30 seconds of progress and 19 and a half minutes of nothing. However, filler isn't the only problem that comes along with a weekly anime release schedule, as neither Dragon Ball Z nor One Piece are plagued with filler like Naruto was. And thus the extra anime we get from these IPs comes in the form of terrible, at least comparatively to modern day anime, pacing that stretches one chapter of manga in the worst case scenario to 2 whole episodes, meaning that each episode of anime only conveys 7 pages worth of information. And thus, while a weekly anime release schedule does create more of an IP, many believe that it's usually at the detriment of said IP. And thus the idea of a weekly anime release schedule seems to be all but eliminated for any anime wanting to be released in 2024 and beyond, as the only projects that have at least recently tried to adhere to the grueling weekly release schedule were anime like One Piece, Boruto, Dragon Ball Super, and children's anime like Doraemon and Detective Conan. However, 2 out of those 5 projects had to go on hiatus in the last year plus, those being Dragon Ball Super and Boruto, with the latter's anime being on hiatus for over a year and the former's being on hiatus for about 8 months. And while obviously Dragon Ball Super is in a much different spot than Boruto because their mangaka is still breathing, technically the reason that both of these projects went on hiatus is the same. Both of these projects suffered heavily from either pacing or filler issues, all because the anime ran a solid risk at catching up with the manga. And that is the perpetual issue with a weekly released anime. Even if you start the anime adaptation when the manga is 100 chapters into its story, if you want to adapt a story with modern day pacing, which is around 3 chapters per episode, you'll catch up to the manga between 30 and 50 episodes in. And if you want to write an 1100 chapter manga like Oda, that means that eventually both your anime and manga releases are going to be weekly, which means any pacing above 1 chapter per episode is gonna mean that the anime cuts into the lead that the manga has. On top of this, the anime is adapting things that have already happened while the manga is reliant on a mangaka. And thus, if anything at all happens to the mangaka, well then pacing and fillers start to creep into the anime. But now with Boruto, Dragon Ball Super, and Black Clover all on hiatus, the only weekly release anime left in existence, not made for Japanese children, is One Piece, who are currently planning a project to recreate the entirety of One Piece as a seasonal anime. On top of this, in a recent conversation with Studio Period's president, he somewhat cryptically revealed that all of the anime that are on hiatus for Studio Period are going to be looked at through a new lens, pretty majorly implying that both Boruto and Black Clover, when they return, will return as seasonal anime, meaning that when these two IP return, One Piece will truly be the final IP adhering to a weekly release schedule. And many people are acting as if they're blindsided by this decision by Studio Period, which is wild to me because not only have I been championing for this to happen for years now, as the weekly anime release schedule is just simply outdated in 2024, but also it's fairly obvious that Studio Period's mentality on anime release schedules has pretty drastically changed in the last couple of years. And the reason I say it's obvious is because for the last couple of years, they've been releasing TYBW. See, because usually the reason that an anime is adapted in a seasonal basis is because the animators in the animation studio don't want to catch up with the manga. However, Bleach's manga has been done for years. In fact, Bleach's manga is so done that TJ Kubo has released 3 light novels that take place after the conclusion of Bleach's manga and has started a new manga. And this was a scenario even in 2022 when TYBW's first season was released. And yet Studio Period decided to release TYBW seasonally, releasing 13 episodes a year, basically. Why? Well, the answer is relatively simple. Because they saw the quality of animation that the rest of the world was putting out. See, Studio Period had already experienced what releasing an anime weekly with no pacing or filler issues looked like. And unfortunately for Black Clover fans, that looked kind of awful. See, there are a plethora of incredible moments in the Black Clover manga that are unfortunately kind of squandered by the anime's adaptation. And that's because the animation at certain times is distractingly bad, an issue that Studio Period was also dealing with in Boruto. And thus, even though Studio Period knows the story they need to adapt, they figured in the fight-heavy arc that is Thousand Year Blood War, they wanted the show to look as good as possible. But why the shift in this mentality now? Well, I hate to be a JJK fanboy, but the first episode of TYBW didn't come out until 2022, October of 2022 to be exact, which was conveniently about a year and a half after JJK and its incredibly well animated season 1 came out. And JJK immediately, because of its animation and story, but mostly animation, took the world by storm, immediately becoming the biggest manga and anime IP on Earth.
Except for One Piece.
So Studio Period, possibly learning from the likes of JJK, decided to break down the last 100 or so chapters of Bleach into a seasonal anime, focusing their time and effort to make it look as good as possible. And the result was one of the most breathtakingly beautifully well-animated seasons of anime I've ever seen. And thus TYBW was welcomed with open arms, especially internationally, as in the interview that we've been talking about with Mishiyuki, the president of Studio Period, talking about Studio Period's future, Mishiyuki said, and I quote, "Bleach Thousand Year Blood War has received great praise overseas. When I go overseas for events, I'm treated like a hero," which means two very important things. One, Studio Pierrot knows the seasonal model is working for them, and two, that Japanese animation studios are starting to take into account the opinions of the international anime fan bases. Which may sound silly to you because,
Nick, they've always been doing that.
but no, they haven't. For the majority of anime's history, the only people whose opinions have mattered are Japanese people's. And this is because, for the majority of anime's history, Japanese people have made up the majority of the people who watch anime. But those numbers are starting to shift. And this is evidenced by the fact that Bleach, which is more popular here in the States than it is in Japan, is getting the kind of funding that it is. And that Chainsaw Man, which was considered a financial flop in Japan, is getting a Reze arc movie because it was seen as a cultural revolution here in the States. But then this leads us to the question, but Nick, if Studio Pierrot knew that seasonal anime release schedules would lead to success, why didn't they do that with Boruto and Black Clover? And the answer is timing. Black Clover has been on hiatus for over 3 years, and Boruto over 1. These projects were unfortunately started before Studio Pierrot made the realization that seasonal was the way to go, and both of these projects caught up to their mangas, with Boruto being almost 75% filler to avoid that very fate. And ever since both of these IPs went on hiatus, there's been no updates about when the continuation of the anime would begin. Outside of course, the Black Clover movie, which wasn't canon, but the Black Clover movie was meant to serve a purpose. It was A, supposed to show us how gorgeous Black Clover's fights in the universe could be if it was given time and money, and B, I genuinely believed the Black Clover movie was released to gauge the public's interest in more Black Clover content, to see if it was worthy of an anime continuation, and seeing how well the anime did probably means that it passed the test with flying colors, which means for the Black Clover fans watching this video, the Black Clover movie was meant to show the fan base what this IP could look like if it was seasonal. And then the fact that the Black Clover movie made it all the way into the top 10 most popular movies on Netflix for a matter of weeks show that there was still a massive amount of interest in Black Clover as an IP, and thus the Black Clover movie could have truly been the straw that tipped the scale for Studio Pierrot leaning towards a full-on dive into seasonal releases. But if Boruto and Black Clover were to switch to seasonal releases, would we see their anime return sooner or later? Well, I think sooner, and by a lot. See, episode 293, the last episode of Boruto, left off in chapter 67, 68-ish of the manga. If you were going to switch from the anime to the manga, I would say read chapter 68, which means as it currently stands, the manga is 21 chapters ahead of the anime. And now, while that doesn't sound like a lot, remember, Boruto is a monthly release manga, which releases 40 pages every single month. And usually with the adaptation of a 40-page monthly release manga, in new-gen anime pacing, one chapter equals one episode. So if Boruto were to return tomorrow, they would be able to adapt 21 episodes with new-gen anime pacing, which is 9 more than is needed for a traditional 12-episode seasonal run. Ironically, this also means that Boruto is about 12 episodes of anime away from its own time skip, which happens at chapter 80. And thus, I believe that the real reason that Boruto decided to take a hiatus when it did, even though when they decided to take their hiatus, they still had more manga to adapt, was that they wanted to create a 1-season-long gap between where they took their hiatus and the time skip that they could fill with their seasonal return. On top of this, Studio Pierrot has been releasing TYBW episodes 12 at a time, 13 at a time, but you get, meaning it's a workflow they're very familiar with. This means that the production of Boruto's return to anime could start as soon as right now, assuming they're aiming for a seasonal return, which appears to be the case. And considering the fact that Boruto is a monthly manga, even if they did start to animate Boruto right now, assuming they burn up an episode per chapter, they would never catch Kishimoto, who would be 9 chapters ahead, assuming that the anime came out tomorrow. But what about Black Clover, which is in a slightly stickier situation with the fact that its manga is now being released quarterly, every 3 months? Well, in 170 episodes of Black Clover, they managed to adapt 270 chapters of the manga, meaning that on average, for the entirety of those 170 episodes, they were adapting about 1.6 chapters per episode, which isn't bad. It's on the lower middle end of new gen pacing, with the higher end being things like the Shibuya arc, but the Shibuya arc is so fight dense, it's easier to adapt quickly. But Black Clover is currently on chapter 369. In fact, they might be on chapter 370 by the time this video goes out, as chapter 370 comes out in 6 days as of the filming of this video, which means there is a full 100 chapters between the manga and the anime right now. And over the course of those 100 chapters, there's 1 3/4 whole arcs, as the anime went on hiatus right before the beginning of the Dark Triad arc, one of the more intense and longer arcs in all of Black Clover. And after that, in the manga currently, we're already 3/4 of the way through the final arc of Black Clover, which means that even if somehow the pacing of Black Clover somehow went up to 2 chapters per episode, we would still be looking at 50 episodes before the anime caught up with the manga, which is 2 long seasons of anime, assuming they do 24 episodes per season, which isn't standard. So assuming that Studio Period approached Black Clover like they're doing TYPW, which is 12 or 13 episodes a year, this would mean it would take 4 years for Black Clover to catch up with its own manga, which with a quarterly release schedule would look like 16 chapters for Tabata to release. 4 chapters a year times 4 years. And while I don't know how many of you are currently caught up with the Black Clover manga, for those of you who are, you'll know that there's not 16 chapters left in this story. The final battle has commenced. Asta has made it back to the battlefield. He's fighting the biggest bad. The rest of the Black Bulls are fighting the smaller bads. And while I do believe that in some capacity, every single one of the Black Bulls is gonna get a chapter-ish long fight, like we just saw in chapter 269 for Luck and Magma, assuming that a fair amount of the Black Bulls are gonna fight in at least couples, like Luck and Magna did, that would mean that we probably have 5 Black Bull fights left, and then we would probably dedicate 4 to 5 chapters for Asta to defeat the main baddie, and then maybe 2 chapters for universe cleanup, Asta marrying Noelle, having kids, the kids have magic or don't, and then bing bang boom, we're done. Quite honestly, I'd be surprised if we got 12 chapters left in the story, let alone 16. And thus, with this line of logic, just like with Boruto, if Studio Period decided to go seasonal with Black Clover, there's nothing stopping them from starting tomorrow. But this wouldn't be the case if they decided to approach Boruto or Black Clover from a weekly perspective, as on a weekly basis, they'd be able to catch up with Black Clover in a year, and considering the fact that Black Clover's manga probably won't be done for a matter of years, they would once again have to go on hiatus, or pull a Soul Eater and try and finish the story in their own way. And in Boruto's case, they would catch up in the manga in 21 weeks, which would be a big issue. And thus the announcement that both Boruto and Black Clover might switch to a seasonal release schedule is massive news for either fan base. Because if this news is genuinely true and being interpreted the correct way, I really see no reason that either of these projects shouldn't have announcements regarding the return of their anime soon. But what does this shift in mentality from Studio Period mean for the rest of the anime world? As Studio Period was one of the final people holding on to the antique that is a weekly release anime. Does this now mean that the weekly release schedule is dead? Well, maybe. Like I've already stated, this now means that One Piece is alone as the only major anime on Earth that is releasing every single week. And even the One Piece team is very clearly and publicly beginning to waver in their love of their own weekly release schedule. See, One Piece's anime is currently paced as bad as it's ever been outside of Reverie. See, when One Piece's anime first started in Romance Dawn and Drum Island, they were adapting 2 whole chapters per episode, new gen pacing, with the only exception to that rule in the beginning of One Piece being Loge Town, which was paced a little bit slower. However, this is because at the beginning of One Piece's anime, they had a ton of room to work with. However, that room slowly but surely got eaten up. As in Alabasta, they had to slow down the pacing from 2 chapters an episode to 1.5 chapters per episode. So roughly the same as Black Clover. Still not bad. However, by the time that the anime got to Alabasta, they had pretty much caught up with the manga, which is why by the time that we get to Enies Lobby, the pacing slows down to 1.2 chapters per episode. But this came more from the fact that One Piece's anime was getting so popular that they switched their time slots in the middle of the Enies Lobby arc, and thus instead of airing 36 episodes a year, they were now airing 48 episodes a year. And this has been their release schedule since 2007 when they made this switch. Now, post Enies Lobby, all the way to Punk Hazard, the pacing is almost a perfect 1-to-1. This is because during this time period, there was almost the exact same amount of manga chapters released as anime episodes released. But like I've already stated, in a weekly release schedule, the anime team is adapting things that have already happened, but the mangaka needs to create new things. And thus, this 1-to-1 schedule schedule can only be maintained so long as the mangaka remains healthy and consistent, which is why in Dressrosa, when Oda was hospitalized, the pacing plunged from 1 to 0.8 chapters per episode. On top of this, after getting out of the hospital, Oda switched his release schedule from weekly to 4 to 5 chapters and then a break built in, which meant that there was now more anime episodes being made than manga chapters being made on a year basis. However, Oda was hospitalized halfway through Dressrosa, which is why Dressrosa's pacing is as high as 0.85. But this new built-in break in Oda's schedule meant that Zoe and Whole Cake Island's pacing was about 0.8 chapters per episode. That, for those of you who don't want to do the math, is about 12 pages of manga per episode of anime. After Whole Cake Island, we got the worst paced arc in the entirety of One Piece, Reverie, which is a 6-chapter arc in the manga and a 12-episode arc in the anime. But while Reverie was the worst paced arc, Wano is the worst paced long arc, as Wano's pace is 0.7 chapters per episode, which is 10 pages of manga per 22 minutes of content. And Wano having this pacing is a response to now Oda doing 3 chapters of manga and then taking a break, meaning that Oda releases 40 chapters of manga a year, and the One Piece anime releases 48 episodes of anime a year. Meaning that with this schedule, the best that One Piece could ever be paced is 0.83 chapters per episode. And that's assuming that Oda is never hospitalized again, never misses another chapter, never loses another mentor and friend like he did with Toriyama. And thus the reality of One Piece moving forward, so long as Oda's schedule remains the same, is that One Piece will have a roughly 0.7 chapter per episode ratio, which is 4 times slower than JJK Season 2. That means that JJK Season 2, which was 24 episodes, if paced like One Piece, would have taken 100. And the One Piece team knows this is an issue, which is why they're creating The One Piece, which is a collaboration between Wit and Netflix to reanimate and create new gen pacing in the entirety of One Piece's story. And The One Piece will be released seasonally. But does this mean that the One Piece anime will stop releasing weekly? No. Probably not, because different studios are animating different projects, and thus there's no financial incentive for Toho to stop animating One Piece when Wit is going to be making all the money on The One Piece, especially when we consider the fact that The One Piece is being done in collaboration with Netflix while One Piece comes out on Japanese television. On top of this, the entire One Piece fandom has Stockholm Syndrome, going so far as to say the terrible pacing makes me feel as though I'm on a journey with the Straw Hats as well, which is a wild excuse for an IP that could just be objectively better by posting less. And that will become massively evident by the fact that The One Piece, which should end up being, if they adapt the entirety of One Piece's story, between 400 and 600 episodes of much better paced content. So is One Piece going anywhere? No, because they still make a bunch of money on it, and they don't need to inject filler because everybody's already okay with the pacing. But trust me when I say, when the dust is settled and One Piece's story is done, much like how nobody watches Full Metal Alchemist and everybody watches Full Metal Alchemist Brotherhood, and much like how if one of your friends wants to watch Dragon Ball, you recommend they watch Kai instead of Z, not a singular soul will pick up One Piece over The One Piece ever again, as One Piece's anime nowadays is basically just like a manga you don't have to read yourself. It takes 4 times longer to consume because, let's be real, if it takes you longer than 5 minutes to read a chapter of manga, you need to go back to school. Unless you're enjoying the artwork, in which case, do you. But what do you guys think about this news that Studio Period is considering bringing Boruto and Black Clover back with seasonal releases? Do you believe that it spells the end for the weekly release schedule and possibly One Piece's weekly release schedule? Do you believe it could bring Boruto and Black Clover back sooner than anticipated? Tell me in the comments below. And while you guys are down there, please, for me, like this video, subscribe to the page, and hit that noti bell.
Oh, but I like the point where Luffy grabs a sumo wrestler's hand and then for 1:48 seconds, it's literally just a scene of them going like this. It makes me feel like I'm there.